The Chinese Grand Prix sprint race had the crowd cheering, but some drivers didn't think it was as exciting as it looked. We had George Russell talking about it being like a kart race as a positive. We had Esteban Ocon using exactly the same metaphor as a criticism. So what's going on? Why the disconnect when it comes to racing F1 2026 style?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think F1 produced probably its most spectacular sprint race we've seen. Absolute thriller over the opening laps. George Russell and Lewis Hamilton overtaking like mad. Charles Leclerc coming at them before George kind of stepped clear and went away. And in the midfield as well, we had this similar, what we now call yo-yo racing. So lots of overtaking and passing. The crowd loved it. They were on their feet. I think we loved it as well. It was good to watch. But the drivers, not as harshly as critical as they were in Australia, they still don't like it. They still think, and Liam Lawson, I asked him afterwards, I said, how was the enjoyment of that? Because he had a great race. He said, not super high. He said, it's not the racing I'm used to. He thinks it's more about battery deployment, who's got energy, who hasn't got energy, and that's deciding the passes. And it's something that the drivers don't particularly like, this spectacular racing. But it does open up a big philosophical debate about, do you judge the success of rules based on if drivers love them or not?
Exactly. And one of the other interesting aspects of it is we had a driver like Ollie Behrman who was in that midfield fight. He lost out to Liam Lawson, so who knows, perhaps that played a part in his criticism. But he said once it has settled down, it became very processional. So there is this idea of, is this yo-yo racing at its best only a short-term thing that happens for 5-10 laps until things settle down and therefore isn't sustainable? And what moves you do see are just everybody settling down into a sustainable battery percentage running, and then it locks in. That seems to be the criticism that's the secondary one to the fact that they don't feel overtakes perhaps are normal, because if you've got 350 kilowatts of power more than the guy next to you, it's much, much easier to go past them.
What is quite interesting is the Ferrari v Mercedes battle at the front. Because I think what we're seeing is different car characteristics, different approaches. You've got a Ferrari with a smaller turbo, so it gets off the line well, can get to the front. Seems to harvest and deploy in a different area to the Mercedes, so which is why we're seeing the variation on that front. But then also we've got a Ferrari that's quicker in the corners, and we've got a Mercedes that's quicker on the straights. So this yo-yo racing is as much to do with different car characteristics of cars that are only a few tenths apart than it is about the actual regulations themselves and the success and failure of that. So we need to see this develop. We need to see if this is sustainable. Can Ferrari pull this off at tracks where the tyre deg doesn't happen and drops them back and allows George to check out? So we are seeing some of these variations, and I think it will be something to develop. And I think tomorrow, as Ollie Behrman said this evening when he said, you know, it was a procession behind me, it's not going to be overtaken, he wants to be proven wrong. He wants to see some racing tomorrow. So I think this time tomorrow, potentially when we stand here, we'll have a bit more of a definitive answer about what is going on with these rules, and are we just seeing at the front, for example, just a fantastically close fight between Mercedes and Ferraris for a few laps until that Mercedes can check out and better tyre deg?
Yeah, and we're going to need a load more races to get a really complete picture of what this racing is like, and it could flatten out massively. That said, I expected China to be much less dramatic in that regard than Australia was, and then the sprint race proved me wrong. So there's still a lot to learn here. But let's get on to what I think is the really key problem here, which is the question of qualifying. Now, Charles Leclerc, he was the driver who made that reference about it no longer being about that crazy lap. So what is it about these cars and the power unit demands that is meaning that you're effectively going quicker by underdriving in corners, which is completely the wrong way round?
Yeah, this isn't something that's restricted to Charles Leclerc. As I've spoken to quite a few people in the paddock tonight who kind of agree with this mentality that qualifying has become counterintuitive, that actually there are moments where going slower makes you quicker, which for a driver in qualifying is completely backwards. Drivers are finding they lose 2 tenths of deployment coming out of a corner because they've been quicker into the corner or going through it faster. So Charles Leclerc, for example, some great qualifying laps, some good effort to go quicker, but just makes him slower. So you're trying to do the opposite of what great Formula One racing's about with these regulations. And you've got strange deployment elements where I think Andrea Stella mentioned to us this evening that a driver can back off in a corner because they have a wobble. Then that gives them, they use deployment less, they can harvest a little bit, and then that gives them a power boost and actually go quicker. So this confusing element of regulations where if the throttle's at 95%, it's in a different engine mode to 98%, and your deployment's totally different, and that impacts the whole lap. I think there's a growing mood that these rules are a bit complex, and it goes down to a fundamental thing that a team boss told me tonight, that Formula One has to ensure that the fastest drivers have the ability to show their talent and can be successful and can win. And right now, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case with where we've got with this rule set.
Yeah, this is the problem. It's always been car dependent because that sets your performance potential. The driver's job is to exploit it. But for the first time, pretty much ever, in qualifying, we've got a situation where being under the limit in corners just pays you back randomly on straights. It's not about trade-offs of entry speeds versus exit speeds. That's in the normal bounds of driving. It's just literally, as Oscar Piastri said when he was talking about Melbourne qualifying, he said, I was getting more confident, carrying more speed through, and that was making me slower on the straights. It was costing him lap time. Counterintuitive is a word, or two words, depending on how you want to spell it, that we've heard a lot recently, and this for me is key, because I think whatever happens in the race, it's always been about management and that kind of thing, but qualifying, I think people watching also want to know it's a test of drivers on the limit. So that's the number one thing for me. I think you can take compromises in the race if you have sustained wheel-to-wheel racing like we had in the sprint.
Yeah, and I think the issue is that a lot of the drivers, they get confused and don't know what's happening. You can argue, management in qualifying is not alien. We've had times in the past, you can think of somewhere like Barcelona, for example, where if you attack turn one, overheat your tyres, that will cost you in the final sector and you'll go slower. So, management has been a factor in qualifying. It's not always about pushing 100%. But I think these rules are so counterintuitive and so confusing for drivers. I understand that Charles Leclerc's effort in sprint qualifying yesterday, for example, had a very quick lap. It all fell apart in the final sector. He lost 4 tenths. That was down to him having a slight lift in a corner earlier in the lap, which offset all the mandatory programming of the computer, affected deployment, gave him power where it gave him no benefit, then left him without power later on in the lap. And I think these are the elements of overly complex rules where it doesn't really allow the fastest driver to show that talent and think for himself.
Yeah, and very, very difficult for those on the outside to understand it, because a lot of the time when you try and understand these things, you run into things in the reg that reference basically offline documents that are not public. And even if you could understand what was in those documents, and some of it gets pretty complicated, you don't even get the chance. And so that is a problem in terms of transparency, because it's just not transparent. If the drivers and teams, a lot of the time, certainly in the moment, don't understand, then you can't expect people at home to understand it. So for me, the number one thing is that qualifying side of things. Now, we did see some interesting comments today from Max Verstappen. He was lively yesterday as well, of course, but he was not happy with the car. I heard from him after the race, and he was saying, just no grip. Anything we do on the setup, it makes no difference. And I said to him, right, well, where's the main limit? Where's the sort of first limitation you're hitting? Front axle, rear axle. He just said, understeer, oversteer, just no grip everywhere. He was not furious, but he had a pretty bleak outlook about Red Bull's position. And this is about the car performance, not purely about the power unit.
Yeah, Red Bull have been a bit baffled since the first lap of FP1, really. They turned up here, the car had looked pretty solid in Melbourne. Potential, we didn't see the full potential of what Max could have done in that race because of his qualifying problem. Through testing, they'd looked competitive. We know that power unit, it's not necessarily on a par with Mercedes or Ferrari, but it's pretty strong. So it was a surprise to see them so far off yesterday, but from the very first lap of F1, just no grip. So the performance wasn't there, and the team don't have a proper answer yet. It's colder here than it's been whenever they've run anywhere. I mean, Barcelona wasn't performance running, but Bahrain was never this temperature. And also the track surface here. We understand that the surface has deteriorated in terms of grip over the last 12 months. 10% less is the estimate. So you've got a track surface that's offering less grip, colder weather as well, so the tyres are operating at a different temperature. Maybe that's pushed the Red Bull out of a window on a track where its energy deployment characteristics may not be as strong as the Mercedes and Ferrari. So I think it's a combination of all these elements has put them at a deficit, which actually, when you compare it, isn't a million miles away from where they were in Melbourne, but obviously not where they want to be, and it's not where Max wants to be if he's going to be fighting for podiums and wins.
And of course, Mercedes are delighted because they are so quick. George Russell won the sprint race, but it's not all been plain sailing, has it? Because George Russell hit trouble in qualifying. Kimi Antonelli got his first pole position, his first proper pole position, rather than just a sprint pole position. So that's fantastic to see and great for him. But he needed a bit of assistance from those Russell troubles, and Antonelli wasn't without troubles as well. So what did you see going slightly wrong for Mercedes, even in their position of supremacy?
Yeah, so George Russell's fresh off the sprint win this morning that had the crowd on its feet, but qualifying didn't go quite well. In Q2, first of all, there was a front wing problem for George, which actually is something Kimi had later on, where the wing was backing off in corner mode, so basically not giving us the estimated grip through corners. Mercedes changed that wing through Q2, so put a fresh wing on, which was fine. But at the start of Q3, he got into anti-stall, the car wasn't running, stopped on track, managed to get it back to the pits. And they did what a lot of teams are doing now with these confusing regulations: Control, Alt, Delete, restart. So they did this once, didn't work, did it for a second time, it worked. He got out and secured P2. So that was a good rescue job there for George and for Mercedes. And Kimi suffered that same wing problem. So the wing was backing off compared to where it had been in the garage at high load. That meant less downforce in corners, and you could see the understeer through his lap. So if teams think they've closed that gap on Mercedes today, I think they can be disappointed, because the reality is Mercedes had a lot more pace if things had worked as intended.
Absolutely, and while we don't know what tomorrow's race will bring in terms of the yo-yo racing, we do expect Mercedes to be at the front.